with us. We haven't forgotten about you. We just got into a little discussion here. We'll be with you in just a minute, so just stay with us. Let's get started. Those of you online, thank you for waiting. We're sorry to hold you up, and we are going to get right back into some of the things in Adventist church in times past that have led us theologically to where we are today. We're going to look at some of those things from the Bible as we go through all of this. So anyway, thank you for being with us. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much, Lord, that we can come to you and ask you for your help and guidance. We know, Lord, when we approach the Bible that none of us has all the answers, but we just ask you, Lord, that you'll open our minds and help us, Lord, to correctly understand the things that you want us to know and to understand. Be with us tonight, Lord, as we look at the way that you have led in the past and as we look at some of these things from the Bible. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, well, we're back on William Miller tonight. Because we're not finished with him, because a lot of the theology, of course, was developed around this man, William Miller. We're not going to go back through things about him, except that now I want to focus a little bit on, remember, he became a person that was now a Bible believer. Let's look at a couple things that he said. He said, I replied that if the Bible was the Word of God, everything contained therein might be understood. Do you agree with that? All right. He was coming out of the background of the age of enlightenment, of rational thinking, right? So if God is an intelligent being, he communicates something to us, obviously it's going to be clear and we can understand it. I think, no, I never read Revelation. I think what he said is true, that the basic issues of salvation are abundantly clear in the Bible. There are many other issues that we probably will never understand. But in any case, he said, I replied that if the Bible is the Word of God, everything contained therein might be understood, and all its parts be made to harmonize. And I said to him, if he would give me time, I would harmonize all these apparent contradictions to my own satisfaction, or I would be a deist still. So you can see a little bit of his reliance on the Bible, but at the same time, his approach of this really straight, rational approach to the Bible. One reason we'll never understand everything in the Bible is we don't entirely understand the culture in which the Bible was written over the hundreds of years that it was written. So some things to us will always be obscure. We know and understand more as time goes along, but there's still a lot of things that we'll never perfectly understand. But in any case, we can see that his change now from being a deist to accepting the Bible was that he could take now this rational approach that he had while he was a deist and now apply that to the Bible. All right. He said that the Bible is given to man as a rule to our practice and guide to our faith, and is properly the revelation of God to man. Would you agree with that? He was on track with that one, wasn't he? And that's pretty much the place that we have always been as Adventists, that the Bible is our only guide, our only rule of faith and practice. Now, this gets confusing for Adventists sometimes because of the writings of Ellen White. Is Ellen White a rule of our faith and practice? Not if you're a true Adventist, it's not. But there are many Adventists that have Ellen White as their rule of faith and practice. But that has never been the position of the Adventist Church. And you see this here, this reflected in William Miller. The Bible and the Bible only. And as we've looked at the Protestant Reformation, that's a good Protestant Reformation principle, isn't it? We get rid of all the extraneous, we'll concentrate only on the Bible and see what the Lord has to say there. All right. He says the just believers at Christ's coming and the unjust 1,000 years afterward, when the judgment of each class will take their place in order of their several resurrections. All right, so now we're making a little transition here. I want you to see William Miller's understanding of end-time events from the Bible. All right, what is he saying here? The coming of Jesus. Okay, after the resurrection, the millennium starts, right? Is that the position we still hold as Adventists today?
Oh, it's after, but not immediately.
All right. When Jesus comes, the righteous go to heaven, and they live and reign with Christ for how long? 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years is completed, then the holy city, the New Jerusalem, comes down from God out of heaven. So this was the view of William Miller. William Miller was very biblical, and we owe a lot to William Miller. I mean, you hear a lot of stuff flying around from these people. I mean, you know, these other religious groups, and I don't mean to be demeaning to them, but it's all this philosophical stuff that has no relevance to the Bible at all. Let's go back a few years, because in more recent times, I'm talking about, you know, within the last 50 years or so, Hal Lindsey was the one that really kind of got a lot of this craziness going. And if you've ever read any of his books, it has nothing to do with the Bible. It's all his view of politics, etc. And so you get a lot of this stuff going around. But fortunately, William Miller was now focused on the Bible, and we owe to him, I think, that legacy that he has given to us of looking at the Bible and understanding the Bible and taking the Bible for what it says.
I was thinking about when the New Jerusalem comes down and everything. That's after the 1,000 years.
That's after the 1,000 years. Yeah. So the New Jerusalem comes down. Satan and the wicked surround the holy city. And then fire comes down and destroys them. No, William Miller was not the first one to do this. However, there were a number of premillennialists. In other words, or I don't know, post or pre, whatever. They said the millennium was before the return of Jesus. And this is kind of where the dispensationalists come from today. You know, there's the secret rapture, then you have the millennium, then Jesus, the second comings after that. But you have, for instance, the Shakers that were teaching that Jesus had already come and we were already in the millennium. There was a lot of millennial talk in the day, and I'm going to come to some of those things in just a minute, but there was a lot of millennial talk in the day of William Miller. So, because here's one reason why. You'd had the Age of Enlightenment and so forth, and in this country now, all the shackles imposed by the social structures of Europe had been broken. And people in this country felt free to think the way they wanted to think. And so you have, okay, this is ushering in now. Surely this is ushering in the millennium. So you have a lot of millennial type thinking and understanding. He said this. He said, "Oh, that Christians might feel the importance of being co-workers with God. For the time is at hand when the captivity of Zion shall return and her walls will be built. Let light be communicated. We ought to do much for the translation and the printing of the Scriptures in different languages." Now, let me ask you, was William Miller an evangelical? Was he wanting to evangelize. Well, I mean, look at this. Jesus is coming soon, so we should translate the Bible and print the scriptures in different languages. What's he saying? Get out there, share the gospel with the world, let the world know that Jesus is coming again. Today, that is good Adventism, isn't it? Isn't that kind of what we're about? Telling the world that Jesus is coming again. And so William Miller was in that camp. Interestingly enough, the group that became the Seventh-day Adventist Church later, after the Great Disappointment, they turned against that. The shut door. Salvation, the probation had closed. No one now needed to hear about the gospel because it was useless. And the only ones that are going to be saved are us if we can hang on and maintain our moral perfection until Jesus comes. He'll take us into his kingdom. That was kind of we'll get into that more another time. But William Miller, we see, had this view of where we are as Adventists today. And where Ellen White and the other Adventist leaders later came as well. I mean, it all turned around. We started sending out missionaries, etc. So basically what happened was the group that became the Seventh-day Adventist Church actually went back now to the views of William Miller and left those earlier views that they had had after the Great Disappointment. Now, I'll throw this text up here and I'll tell you why in just a moment. This is one that's a second angel's message that we're familiar with. A second angel followed the first one saying, "She has fallen, great Babylon has fallen. She has made all people drink of her wine, the strong wine of her immoral lust." All right. So, Babylon is fallen, is fallen. Now, you may think that nobody had ever heard of that passage until after the Great Disappointment. Because this is where many of the Adventist Christians, especially those that became Seventh-day Adventists later on, came. They said, okay, all the churches now have fallen. Actually, there was great disagreement later in the Adventist church over whether it was just Roman Catholicism or if it included the Protestants. And so you may remember that in great controversy, Ellen White said it one way, and later on she became convinced it was the other way, and she changed it. So now it included both groups. But that was not the first time that anyone had ever read and thought of this passage. So what I want us to do for just a moment is think a little bit about kind of the climate in which William Miller was working there in partly New England. It was on the border of New England and New York. But that whole area, New York and New England, there were a lot of things that were going on. This idea was very popular at the time. Anyone, can you think of what? Now, remember, you have Methodists now, you have Baptists, and they have come in and they have sort of overthrown the established churches. Remember we mentioned last week the established churches, their memberships just went down to nothing. The Methodists and the Baptists grew. And so the Methodists and the Baptists now, they were proclaiming Babylon had fallen. What great event about this time would have led them to that conclusion? Well, Civil War was in the 1860s, so this is a little earlier. Well, even before that. What happened near the turn from the 1700s to the 1800s? What great event would have led people to say Babylon is fallen? I'll give you a date, 1798. There you go. Napoleon had taken, so Napoleon was a great hero, right? Because Napoleon now had put Babylon out of business. And the Protestants and the Methodists and the Baptists and so forth, they were all very happy and rejoicing about this because now the papacy had been put out of business. Babylon had been put out of business. Now, it caused them a lot of consternation when a few years later the Pope was reestablished back in Rome. But in any case, this is one thing that had a big impact on the thinking of the people up there at this time. So they saw this now as one of the things that would portend the return of Jesus. The fall of Babylon, we know. If you go from Revelation 14 through Revelation 19, it's all about the fall of Babylon, isn't it? And so we see now Babylon, in their mind, Babylon had fallen. So what remained to happen now? Jesus would return. And it's true. I mean, you go look at Revelation, when you have the final fall of Babylon, it's because Jesus is coming and the rider on the white horse now crushes Babylon. And so in their mind, Babylon had fallen. There were some other events that sort of got them thinking about the return of Jesus. Can you think of what those events might have been from your Adventist understanding of Bible prophecy?
When I was young, I always heard about some stars falling.
All right, that was until 1833. So that, yeah, I mean, it was, by the time of William Miller, there were some events that were earlier as well. Okay, the dark day was when? 1780. So you have the dark day, then 1798, the Pope taken captive. Of course, the dark day was just in New England, we understand that, but this is the area that we're talking about and trying to get some background on William Miller. So you have now, Babylon has fallen, the great dark day has taken place. Back in 1755, earlier, there had been an earthquake in Europe, the Lisbon earthquake. That was a great earthquake. But that, by the way, is not the earthquake that had the real impact on the Millerites. The earthquake that had an impact on them was someplace else. Where was it? Oh, come on, guys. Right here in Memphis. The New Madrid earthquake in 1911 and 1912, when in November through February, it struck 4 times with an earthquake near 8 on the Richter scale. Now you stop and think about that for just a moment. A series of earthquakes. Reelfoot Lake was not formed until February of 1912. So the first earthquake was in November, but the earthquake that formed Reelfoot Lake wasn't until 3 or 4 months later.
Was it 18 or 19?
19. 1912. No.
That was 18.
1812. 18. I'm sorry. My bad. Yes. Yeah. So this is one of the things that got them thinking about. Let me give you a comparison. The earthquake in San Francisco, the Great San Francisco earthquake, was moderately felt over 6,000 square miles. Okay? The earthquake that took place here was moderately felt over 1 million square miles. It was much, much, much greater than the San Francisco earthquake. But here's the thing. There wasn't a lot of population here then. I report back a few years ago, and this has been a number of years ago, when I lived in California back the first time in LA, I used to read about earthquakes because, anyway, I was reading about the New Madrid. Yeah, said, okay, I was reading about the New Madrid one, and anyway, they were saying if it struck with the same intensity today as it struck back then, it would destroy Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, all the big Midwestern cities, Memphis, of course, as well. Will be pretty much obliterated. FEMA says the same thing. I've got it up here somewhere. Yeah, here it is. November 2008. So this has not been all of that long ago, 10 years ago, but still. It says the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, says that the highest economic losses due to a natural disaster in the United States, if this one lets it go again with the same intensity, FEMA says it'll be the biggest financial loss the country has ever suffered from a natural disaster. It said it will cause widespread and catastrophic damage across Alabama, Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, and particularly Tennessee. So you think about that for just a moment. I mean, look at the states included there. You're talking about a tremendous amount of population. It says, where a 7.7 magnitude quake or greater would cause damage to tens of thousands of structures affecting water distribution, transportation systems, and other vital infrastructure. None of us know when this thing's going to let loose again, but when it does, you want to run. So, now everybody's going to go home and have nightmares tonight, right? But earthquakes, well, I've been through a few. I'm sure you have too, Wayne. And it's not a fun thing. It gets pretty scary. Yeah. Yeah, I know. You're in your house and you say, this is going to fall down. I went through one time we were standing outside. That one wasn't so scary. The earth was rocking and rolling and so forth. Actually, I was sitting in the car, and Shari had run in a store, and the car was rocking and rolling. I said, man, that's kind of wind must be really blowing hard. I got out and figured out, it's not the wind. We're having an earthquake, and it was shaking things around. This New Madrid earthquake, when it broke loose, there was sulfur that filled the air and darkened the skies. So there was stuff coming out from the inside of the earth here, as well as the earthquake itself. So, in any case, this earthquake obviously got the attention of the people up there in New England. And so, just another thing that they looked at, Jesus is coming again. What does the Bible talk about? Go to Revelation chapter 6. What does the Bible say is going to happen before Jesus comes? A tremendous earthquake. Every mountain and island be moved out of their place and so forth. And so all of these Bible prophecies got their attention as they interpreted those particular events. So when William Miller started talking about the return of Jesus, it was not in a vacuum. Do you understand that? It was not in a vacuum, and it was in a place where people were willing now to have different views. They weren't tied to the structures as they had been in Europe. So people were much freer to think in the way that they wanted to think. And that's why when you look at New York, William Miller was in eastern New York, but you look in eastern New York through central New York, and that is where you have many of the various kinds of movements of rights and different sort of thinking that is taking place. What is the home of the women's rights movement in this country? Sure, central New York. Yeah, right there on the Finger Lakes. So you had the temperance movement. I threw this up here too because I wanted us to understand that there was a big temperance movement, and the temperance movement was related to the women's rights movement, but it also was related to this millennial thinking of the people that were looking to say, hey, Jesus is coming again. And so the two kind of got intertwined. And the women's rights movement, they were for the temperance organizations because the women were tired of getting beat up by their drunk husbands. All right? So they became, get rid of the alcohol. The Christians became temperance people because they felt like they better get their act together before Jesus came. And so that was kind of the driving force behind it. And for William Miller, it's really interesting. There were a couple things that ended up causing him some disquiet as he was moving now into the proclamation about the return of Jesus. One of those was the temperance movement. Because while William Miller never was a drunkard, maybe, or a big drinker, we do know that even towards the end of his life, he drank wine, and we also know that he grew apples on his farm that were primarily used to make apple brandy that was popular in that part of the country. So there was an economic reason for him not to get too big on the temperance bandwagon. But we do have William Miller also, talking about, sin and evil and getting away from those kinds of things. So he found himself kind of in a quandary. Another interesting thing was happening at the time, and that is that the Masons were strong. I mean, look at your dollar bill, right? And you can understand very quickly how strong the Masons have been traditionally in this country. But what you have now at that time is the Methodists and the Baptists turning against the Masons. William Miller was a lifelong Mason. So now he found himself in a bind, right? He felt like that the Masons were a good charitable organization. He was a Grand Master in the Masonic Lodge. And so now he found himself in this bind. Finally, he gave up the Masonic order because he said he didn't want to be disruptive to his other Christian brethren. And he would rather talk about the return of Jesus than fight them over the Masons. And so he got out of the Masons. But it doesn't mean that he felt good about it. He just did it because he felt like it should be done. In any case, that gives you a little bit of the idea of the kind of background that William Miller was working against. And so he was talking about the return of Jesus. And when he started talking about the return of Jesus, this was not strange and unusual stuff. People had been thinking about this. When he went out to make his proclamations, this is his kind of self-description. You'll see a couple of these items here. He called himself, you see, an old man, an old dry stick, an old stammering man, and he called himself a great wicked sinner. So that's kind of how William Miller characterizes himself in his self-depreciation. But don't put too much stock in that. William Miller he came across with humility, but William Miller was a pretty tough character as well. And, he was kind of hard on disagreement. He was even kind of hard on pastors. And pastor didn't agree with him, and so, he had a strong personality. But he, at the same time, was a person that also, especially the more he got into preaching himself, he became a little more humble about things.
He was never a licensed pastor himself.
He was never ordained as a pastor, but he certainly did a lot of preaching. Yeah. Yeah. William Miller, I should mention this too, just for whatever it's worth. William Miller was really highly respected in the community. William Miller held a number of significant positions. We won't go into all of that. But he also was the wealthiest man in the county. We know that because of the tax records indicate that he paid the most school tax of anybody. And so William Miller was pretty successful. He was well respected, and he was successful in business and so forth and so on. In any case, he began now the proclamation of the return of Christ. Let me read you just a little bit here quickly. This gives us some perspective about William Miller's belief. He says, anyone who believes in Christ may take him by faith and go to God and find mercy, and such will in no wise be rejected. So William Miller was pretty solid, wasn't he? Remember we talked last week about how he had become a deist, etc., because of this struggle that he had of trying to be good enough for God. But he came to an understanding of grace later on. Anyone who confesses will receive forgiveness of sins through the intercession of Jesus Christ. Now listen to this. Think of this in terms of Adventist language. Forgiveness of sin through the intercession of Jesus Christ and the sprinkling of his blood in the Holy of Holies and upon the mercy seat and upon the people. The understanding about the sanctuary did not originate with others later. William Miller here, as you can see, obviously talked about these things early on. He says, Jesus will eventually take away the sin of the world, and all impenitence will be destroyed from earth and sent away into a place prepared for the devil and his angels. I believe Jesus will come again in his glory and in person to our earth. And then he says this, he says, I believe that the second coming of Christ is near, even at the door, even within 21 years, or on or before 1843. You didn't hear anything about 1844 there, did you? On or before 1843. William Miller consistently said that Jesus would come between 1843 and 1847, or he said other times he would come on or before 1843. All right. He says, you may depend on it, my friends. This is a letter, actually, now that he wrote out to some people that had become Universalists. You know, Universalists don't believe in anything, right? They're kind of like where American population is today. He says, you may depend on it, my friends, that Jesus will come within 12 years. In the year 1843 or before. In that year, the prophecies will be completed. The dead saints or bodies will be raised. Those children of God who are alive then will be changed and caught up to meet the Lord in the air, where they will be married with him. The world and all the wicked will be burned up, and then Christ will descend and reign personally with his saints. And at the end of the 1,000 years, the wicked will be raised, judged, and sent into everlasting punishment. This is the second death. Is that pretty much where we are as Adventists? Yeah, it goes back to William Miller. So, long before the Adventist church was established. Listen, all the major things that we have believed and accepted as Adventists were well in the works before there ever was an Adventist church. By the way, William Miller was not a vegetarian, but you know vegetarianism was kind of popular among some groups up back in his day. We don't think of it that way, but there was some wild stuff going on, and vegetarianism was part of it. You had a lot of communes. I mean, if you think the communes started back in the 60s and 70s with the hippies, you've never read the history of early America. They had a lot of communes that were started, and they had different approaches of the communes. And some were, from the standpoint of sexuality, anything with anybody was okay. And these were, most of the time, they were spiritual, quote unquote, people, that would gather together in these communes. Some of them were even doing these things in anticipation of the return of Jesus. But anyway, there was a lot of stuff going on. I won't go into all of that, but just some really, really interesting history back then. And when you read some of the things Ellen White wrote about fanaticism, etc., she's really reflecting to some degree on some of the stuff that started creeping in among early Adventists. Okay, let's move on. Now, Daniel 8:14. This is the prophecy where William Miller was drawing the 1843 things that we just got, right? We all know the text, Daniel 8:14. He said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then shall the sanctuary be restored to its rightful state. Okay? What starting date did William Miller take for this Bible prophecy? Okay?
There was a couple of dates that they around that.
457? All right. Now, 538 was another date too, you're right. But the starting date was 457. So William Miller took that.
It was whenever the decree went out to rebuild.
The decree went out. Here's the issue. There was more than one decree. Yeah. So you have to pick and choose. But William Miller chose this one. And Adventists have gone along with that. This comes from our statement of beliefs. All right? In 1844, at the end of the prophetic period of 2,300 days, he entered, that is Jesus, of course, he entered the second and last phase of his atoning ministry. Do you notice a change there that's taken place in the statement of beliefs? Look at that carefully. I found that kind of interesting when I examined it carefully. Do you see anything there?
Where did that come from?
This is our statement of beliefs. This is straight out of the church manual. Yeah, our statement of beliefs It's the one on the 2300 days in the sanctuary. In 1844, at the end of the prophetic period of 2300 days, now it's 1844 now, not 1843. You see that, of course. He entered the second compartment of the sanctuary. Does it say that? What does it say now? He entered the second phase of his atoning ministry. The language is a little different there. The second phase of his atoning ministry, which was typified by the work of the high priest in the most holy place of the earthly sanctuary. So to say that it was typified here, but he entered into the second phase. And there's no language here about him going from one compartment to another, which has often been taught in the past, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, there you see reflected William Miller's teaching. The only thing that you see really changed from William Miller is that now, of course, Jesus is starting a new phase of ministry. In William Miller's day, the ending of the 2300-day prophecy was what? Was the second coming, the cleansing of the earth, which was considered to be the sanctuary. Now in Adventist theology, that has been changed to be the sanctuary in heaven, and the date has been changed from 1843 now to 1844. So there are a couple differences from where William Miller was. All right, the prophecy in Daniel. 70 weeks are decreed upon your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both the prophecy, the vision, and the prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of the anointed. So in any case, you see there what was being used as the starting date. Okay, where is this found? Daniel what? No. Daniel 8:14 has the 2,300 days in the sanctuary be cleansed. The starting date that William Miller refers to is found where? In chapter 9. In the next chapter, in a different prophecy, in a different vision. But William Miller tied the two together. And so have we as Adventists in order to arrive at the date of 1843 or 1844. The prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 deals with the coming of Messiah the first time, right? And the starting date for that we take as 457 BC, bringing us down to the time of Jesus. And then we know, of course, that Jesus calls the sacrifice to cease in the middle of the week, etc. And so we understand that prophecy. But we take these two prophecies now and we tie them together. So we take the prophecy concerning the coming of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, etc., and we take the starting date for that prophecy, and now we go back and we say that also now is the starting date for the prophecy of Daniel 8:14, the 2300 days. Do you understand that? You understand? Okay. So what you have to do is you have to search those passages to say, is that legitimate? To take the starting date for this prophecy and use it as a starting date for the previous prophecy. All right? William Miller did, and his Adventists have as well. The rest of that prophecy goes like this. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem till the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then there shall be 62 weeks. It shall be built again with the squares and a moat. That's the city of Jerusalem, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and even to the end there shall be a war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for a half a week he shall put an end to the sacrifice and the offering, and on the wing of the abominations shall come one who makes desolate. Now, as Adventists, we have always seen, and so did William Miller, that that prophecy is all about the first coming of Jesus and his work that he did. I think we're on good, solid ground with that. I see no issue that we can take. We kind of go from the time of Jesus back to get the 457 BC date because, like I said, there's more than one date, all right, you could choose from. We go with the 457, and I think that's correct. And I think it's a great prophecy about the coming of Messiah. I think it's one of those great prophecies of Daniel that's accurate, that is right on. And what we have, though, is many in our world today, they take that last week of the prophecy, and what do they do with it? They shove it down at the end of time. They totally separate it from the prophecy altogether and throw it down at the end of time. It makes no sense whatsoever. I think as Adventists, we have a great heritage here. We can talk, and I think legitimately so, about how God in the Old Testament foresaw the coming of Messiah and how important it was to God that Jesus would come and bring forgiveness of sin and salvation to the world. We can do that as Adventists. The dispensationals can't do that. They're just all over the place, and it makes no sense. But this one makes sense. Frankly, it's a little more of a stretch. We're on solid ground with that 490-year prophecy. It's a little bit more of a stretch to tie the two together, all right? So you have to go back and study and say, okay, how do I make that jump now from Daniel 8:14 to this one to arrive at the ending of the 2300 days? How do I do that? So go study it yourself. I'm working on that one. There's some interesting things there that I think we haven't taken into consideration. I'm not going to share that with you. But go do your own study. Anyway, that just alerts you to what you may need to do. And that's just the last part of the verse. And then here's the math that you've all seen before, and we won't belabor that. So you have 457, you subtract that from 2300, brings you down to 1843. By the way, why does 1843 keep coming up and never 1844? It depends on whose calendar you use. Depends on which Jewish calendar you use. And they're two different traditions. So, anyway, that's the difference. And so what happened was, after the disappointment in 1843, they went back and, not so much William Miller, but some of the others went back and said, oh, we used the wrong Jewish calendar. We like this one better because this one brings us to 1844. So let's not be disappointed after all. That's why in 1844 now, they call it the Great Disappointment. The first one was the disappointment, and then came the Great Disappointment because there wasn't a third Jewish calendar to draw from.
Was he involved in both of them?
William Miller? William Miller was extremely careful about setting a date, and you've seen that from the statements that we just read. You know, he says, well, on or before 1843, right? Those are the kind of statements that William Miller would make. And William Miller knew that you had to be a little bit careful with these dates. He knew that roughly it was on track. But he didn't want to tie it down too much. He knew that Jesus had said, you don't know the day or the hour that I'm coming back. But later on, after the disappointment in 1843, William Miller acquiesced to some other strong voices that said, no, man, we've got this thing down. We know the day. It's October 22. It's going to happen. And so William Miller at that point just sort of rolled with it. But William Miller was on track the first time. And but Jesus didn't come back. So, of course, that had to be answered too. What really was going to happen? And what we have to look at now is we have to look at the Bible study that they did, those early Adventists, to bridge the disappointment of 1843 to arrive at the date of October 22, 1844. And so we'll look at that, and we'll examine that, and then you can make the determination if they did enough Bible study or if they should have done more. All right. Your eyes are sleepy, I can tell it. So
He was
let's go home.
he had a group called the Millerites. How many were there? Very many people involved in that.
Well, basically those that followed the understanding of the 2300 days, ending in 1843, they became known as Millerites. Um, but keep in mind, this movement, William Miller was sort of the grandfather leader of it, but he was not the most capable leader. You had many other leaders that were leading out in this movement. It wasn't just William Miller. But they became kind of characterized, more in the media than anything else, as a Millerite. And so, but it kind of went with the territory because you had all of these leaders up there of these communes and these societies and these movements, and they were often named after the leader. And so it was not really all that unusual that they would start calling them Millerites. All right, I don't know if that helps any or not to kind of understand the background of sort of the where all of this got started as Adventists.
Basically
In
in New England.
New England.
New England was where all this place.
Well, New York is not New England, but it was right across the river from Vermont. So, yeah. And then, of course, Ellen White was from Maine, and, Joseph Bates from there as well, or from Massachusetts, actually.
He was actually born in Maine, wasn't he?
Joseph Bates?
No, Miller.
Oh, William Miller was born in Massachusetts. And then the family moved over to New York. Yeah. But in any case, if you ever get a chance to read the history of that area of the country from like the mid 1700s to the mid 1800s, it's just, or even to the early 1900s, just really, really interesting what was taking place.
In all the study of that, it's always been interesting to me that they paid absolutely no attention to that part in Matthew 24 that says you don't know the day nor the hour.
Well, William Miller did. That's the reason he was reluctant to see them set a date. He was always real, kind of flexible on the date. William Miller was a pretty good guy. And I think he really did his best to do what the Lord wanted him to do. And he did his best to understand. He was a long way from being perfect in his understanding, but I think he really, really did his best. My hat has always been off to William Miller. I think William Miller was a good guy, and I think he did his very, very best to stay on track.
Known about his life after that disappointment.
He didn't live very long.
He didn't live too long after that. No, by the way, when William Miller started all this, he was 50 years old. And this is one reason he was so reluctant to go out and start preaching these things. He knew, all the backlash he would get and so forth. And he was 50 years old, and he just felt like he was too old to tackle this kind of stuff. The life expectancy, he was 10 years older than the average life expectancy of his day at 50. So he felt like a really old man.
In those days, the life expectancy was only 46.
Yeah,
So he knew he was an old man.
right.
Did he go into other churches primarily, or did he go into some of these other churches and then also have other independent type meetings where people came?
Yeah, he did both. He actually started in the Baptist churches because he was Baptist. His family were Baptist. He had Baptist preachers in the family. And so he was really tied into the Baptist societies in that area. They didn't have really conferences. They were sort of, loosely organized societies. And he was tied into those. They would have conferences where they would all come together, but they weren't, structured conferences as we think of it. And so he was really tied into that. And that's where it started. Then, of course, you bring in the Methodists. And later on, he brought in other pastors of other denominations over in Boston, for instance. Josiah Lynch and so forth. And then it really started taking off when he got some of these better known pastors behind him. But sometimes they would have general gatherings, but most often they were in churches.
He also was a guest speaker at many different churches in his early days.
Mm-hmm.
They'd invite him to come in and present his findings.
Right. he was reluctant just because, once again, the backlash and his age and so forth. He was a little reluctant to do it. The story of the Maple Grove may or may not be totally accurate. But, okay. Anything else before we go home tonight? You keep me on track. I hope we're on track with what you want to do here. I'm trying to bring in some of the theological things so we can kind of see, how we got to where we are today. All right? Okay.
Well, the Adventist church didn't actually start until when?
1863, yeah. That was the official organization.
The
Yeah.
Seventh Day.
The Seventh-day Adventist Church started in 1863. Yeah, officially.
So at first they were Adventists, but after the Great Disappointment, the seventh Sabbath was introduced, and they picked the two main beliefs that separated them
It was about 20 years in
from
the
everybody
formation.
else and put it part of the name.
Right.
Were they really known as Adventists before the Great Disappointment?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they were?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the William Miller people are known as Adventists. Yeah. By the way, that was a common name that was already in society as well. I mean, there were Adventists before William Miller started talking about the second coming, because once again, all of these things we just talked about, people were looking for the second coming, and then they tend to be characterized as Adventists.
Today, the Seventh-day Adventist is shortened just to Adventist. Most people.
Yeah, that's another topic, but for a long time people would do the abbreviation SDA, and actually the churches ask us not to do that anymore, even though I see it in some of their own publications, but because it's giving us a. Those of you online, we're going to let you go, and thanks for being with us tonight, and we'll see you next week.
There's enough without